And welcome to a special edition of the Sunday Night Sitdown. I am your co-host, KHARI MOSLEY, here with my colleagues, Miracle Jones and Ryan White. And we've been away for a few weeks, recovering from a very, very grueling election season. And very excited for our first episode coming out of the primaries. We have an extra special guest. We're so excited to welcome U.S. Senator Bob Casey from the state of Pennsylvania onto the Sunday Night Sit Down, and we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation about the important issues of the day, as well as to explore the background of the U.S. Senator from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who's been well-known in political circles and comes from a very well-known political family as well from northeastern Pennsylvania. But hopefully we'll find some cool things out about the senator that you may not know about, that sometimes you may not hear on Meet the Press or MSNBC. So wow, this is really exciting. And thank you, Miracle, for your hard work behind the scenes and making this happen. So, before we bring the senator on, is there a few words that you want to say, Miracle? Because, definitely a hat tip to you is well deserved, for your work behind the scenes and helping pull this together.
No, we're very excited and honored that the senator would take the time out to join us for the Sunday Night Sit Down. Over the past year, we've been at home here in Pennsylvania, watching legislation be introduced, and Pennsylvania has been at the forefront of many issues. And so we thought, what better way to start this second season of the Sunday Night Sit Down than to have the senator come and just talk about who he is, his vision for Pennsylvania, and some of the cool legislation that he has coming up this session.
Absolutely. Ryan, do you have any quick words before we jump in with our guest?
I just wanted to echo what Miracle was saying real quick. That we're grateful for the senator for taking the time to talk to us today. Excited to talk about any upcoming legislation, just various issues that's been facing his constituents. And I'm excited to get into it.
Absolutely. And without any further ado, we are going to bring in the United States Senator for the state of Pennsylvania, Bob Casey.
Well, KHARI, thank you very much. I want to thank you and Miracle and Ryan for this opportunity. It's rare that we get a chance to spend this much time to walk through a number of issues, and I'm honored to be part of the show. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. And we'll start with, with the first question, just a little bit of background. Now, we all know that, you come, from a family that's been involved in public service, for decades. But, what, made you, want to make that jump? I know you went to law school and again have been around, government and service throughout your entire life. But, as someone who also married into a political family, you all know everyone in the family does not get into the family business. So what made you get into the family business?
Well, KHARI, it's a great question. I'm not sure I can narrow it down to one reason or one motivation, but I was really fortunate. I think I should start with that. And I've had opportunities a lot of young people didn't have for several reasons. Number one is I had a member of my family ahead of me in politics. That happened to be my father. And the reason I start with him is because he not only, because of his involvement, opened doors for me, either directly or indirectly. And when I ran the first time for statewide office, I had a big advantage, which is name identification, which is not always the case. So people knew the name and had a positive feeling about his service. So to have someone in your family who's experienced it and can give you a good example and also has a kind of a path cleared to a certain extent, that was an enormous advantage. But it does start with who you are. I made a decision that I wanted to at least try public service, try to get elected to public office. And I thought it was one way to give back. I was educated by Catholic nuns and Jesuit priests, and they said it different ways and had different messages, but the in some ways, the same message came through, that if you have an opportunity, not everyone does have an opportunity, but if you have the opportunity, you should try to provide some service of some kind. And it doesn't have to be obviously in the pathway or use the pathway that I chose, but that was kind of ingrained in me as a young person. But I was really fortunate to have two good parents who were great examples. My mother was raising 8 children, which is pretty difficult, but she also served her community. She did so much, and so having two really good examples gave me a great foundation. So, and I was fortunate.
Thank you. I think Ron's going to have a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that answer, for providing that background. And so I just wanted to ask, it's kind of another general question. If you could talk a little bit about, what your political philosophy is, what your approach to different issues is, whether that be just developing like an overarching stance on something, whether that be, your approach in deciding how to vote on a bill, and just, how that's evolved over the years as well.
Yeah, I think some general principles. Some have a more maybe a more hardened ideology that governs every decision they make or every position they take. I guess I have some of that, but a lot of what I try to do is to think about the role of government as a positive instrument to help people improve their lives. Some people don't believe that. They think that it should be very, very limited and the private sector does everything better. I understand that, but that's not where I come down. I think probably the most dramatic example of that was just in the last couple of months. We passed the American Rescue Plan, which was a substantial piece of legislation when it came to just families with children or families struggling, low-income families, middle-income families. And by making a number of changes on food assistance, on the child tax credit, on several tax credits to support families, as well as to provide direct support to families, including a $1,400 check preceded by a $600 check in December. By taking just those steps, and there are many more I could mention, we know now the data is already showing that we improve people's lives. We began to help them rebuild after the pandemic. So that philosophy, I think, or that approach was borne out, was validated by what we did most recently. And I think government, when it's at its best, when it is efficient and effective, and when it spends taxpayer dollars wisely, can be a very powerful source of good in the life of a lot of families, a lot of communities. So that's kind of the general approach. And I obviously have spent a lot of my time as a public official focused on children, and we're going to be spending even more time this summer talking about a new initiative we have for America's children.
Thank you. Miracle?
Yeah, thank you for that response, Senator. And you talked about, the use of government being a force for good. We know, as we kind of alluded to earlier, Pennsylvania has kind of gotten a lot of scrutiny over the past 6 months election cycle, just because, the current president is from here and because of like the Act 77 misinformation. So as someone who's trying to put forth a lot of legislation, how have you been able to talk with people about election integrity and election protection during these times, so that people feel that, that you're working for them, that their government is working for them, and that these policies will benefit them and their children?
And Miracle, is a great question, because there's a narrative throughout the country right now that's based upon the big lie about the presidential election. That somehow there was something wrong and you had widespread fraud. None of that is true. That's 100% fiction. It's a big lie. And unfortunately, if you tell a lie loud enough and long enough, a lot of people believe it. And that's what we're seeing around the country. And it pains me to say there are plenty of Pennsylvanians that have embraced the big lie. Or at least if they don't fully believe it, they're embracing it to gain or to maintain political power. and that includes a lot of elected officials. I mean, we had members of our congressional delegation from Pennsylvania, which is basically 50-50, half Republican, half Democrat. All but one Republican in that delegation voted on January the 6th, after the attack on the Capitol, after the insurrection took place. They voted not to certify the election, the electoral vote from Pennsylvania. I mean, that if that isn't an insult to the state that you represent, basically saying that in the case of those 8 Republican House members, my election was fine. I was reelected, so everything's good. But that presidential election was full of fraud. I mean, the gall of that, the insult to voters to try to perpetuate that lie, knows no bounds. And we've got to hold people accountable who engage in that kind of conduct. But the good news is Joe Biden was able to carry Pennsylvania in that election. And one of the ways that we got through that election, of course, is what you made reference to at the beginning of your question, Act 77. That was a wildly bipartisan bill passed in the General Assembly, State House, State Senate, in 2019. Of course, not knowing there'd be a pandemic and we would need a new voting system for early voting and mail-in ballots and the like. And we all know the result. Not only did Joe Biden win the election in Pennsylvania, but the turnout was the highest. It was either the highest ever or the highest in more than 120 years. But either way, it was more than 70% turnout. So in the end, it all worked out. But we have to continue to fight the battle on voting rights. That's why this Senate Bill 1, like the House version, the For the People Act, is essential to pass. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is essential to pass as well, because we have to defend voting rights today in ways we couldn't have even imagined even 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, and Senator, that was going to be my follow-up, is to go into For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Could you take both of those and kind of pull out some of the major highlights and why those certain elements of the bill that you would like to highlight are so important, particularly in this moment, where we have 2022 implications, where we have candidates, some who have run against you in the past, who are now running for other offices on almost a platform centered around the big lie. So what are some of the elements of these two pieces of legislation that are so important in this moment?
Yeah, KHARI, it's a great question, because I think people have heard a little bit or even a lot about both, but they might think of them as kind of interchangeable, and they really aren't. We need both. It's the For the People Act, the Senate Bill 1 is rather new for a lot of people. It's only really been around or debated, I should say, the last couple of months. But that is a bill that is much wider in scope than the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is meant to deal with a particular specific problem in a Supreme Court case from 2013, the so-called Shelby County case, where in the law for more than a generation, you had this pre-clearance requirement that the Justice Department would have to pre-clear or give prior approval to a state law that infringed, had some impact on voting rights in a state that had a bad record. So if you had a state, for example, in the South that had a bad record on civil rights, and were on a list of states that had to have that pre-clearance, that was a protection in place for voting rights for a long time. So you couldn't just have a state legislature act without the Justice Department clearing it. That pre-clearance requirement was taken out by the Supreme Court. So in essence, we have to put it back in and update our voter laws to reflect that. But that's a fairly narrow but very important focus for that bill. The For the People Act is gigantic. It covers elections and voting. That's a big part, and that's will get the most attention. But there's a whole other set of provisions on dark money. Ever since 2010, in the Citizens United case, that has allowed this proliferation of billionaires buying elections. They can spend virtually any dollar amount they want in any election. There's no limits, and they're shrouded in all layers of layers of darkness. You can't find out who they are or what their interests are. So we don't want that to persist. So we're going to, in this bill, we're going right at that problem of dark money to have more sunlight, more disclosure, more transparency. And then the third part of the bill is on ethics. Like a president has to file their tax returns, right? The Supreme Court needs some ethical boundaries. Sometimes you have Supreme Court justices that are, running around giving speeches to groups that they should probably appear in front of, things like that. And members of Congress, it will not shock you, need a little more on the ethics front as well. But the big part of the For the People Act is on voting rights and elections. We want to make sure there are some basic national standards so people's right to vote is protected, especially if they live in communities of color who seem to be the direct target of these hundreds of state legislative efforts to undermine voting rights. We got to make sure that those communities of color are protected under law and with strong enforcement powers, so that everyone can vote. And you ought to be able to vote on your own schedule and in the way that you want. We shouldn't be limiting voting, for example, in Pennsylvania, like we used to before 2019, to 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on one day, a general election, one day of the year. That doesn't make any sense. And this law will substantially push back against all these right-wing state legislative efforts that are now targeting black voters, targeting communities of color, and targeting young people as well, because they're worried that if those Americans keep voting in high numbers, like we saw in the state of Georgia, which gave us the Senate majority, that their corporate power on the Republican side will be diminished because they'll keep losing elections. So we have to push really hard to get this bill done, and there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you. We'll go to Ron for a follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Senator, for addressing all of that legislation as well. And I just wanted to ask, one more question, kind of in connection to that big election line, all the fallout that we've seen related to that. So obviously there was that vote recently that didn't reach that 60 votes majority related to creating that commission for the investigation for the incidents on January 6th. And like I just said, that fell short of reaching those 60 votes. So I was just wondering, if you had anything you wanted to say on that, if you wanted to talk about why you supported that, why you think it is so important for that commission to have been created, and why you think, some of your colleagues may not have seen it that same way.
Yeah, first of all, I'd say not supporting that legislation that would create a January 6th commission. Not supporting that, I think, was a terrible insult to the country. There's no other way to say it. I could use stronger language, but I won't. But because for this reason, I've heard the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell from the state of Kentucky, say over and over again, "Oh, we don't need it. See, we have all these prosecutions going on of hundreds of individuals," and I agree with him that that's good, that's happening. And then we have the opportunity in Congress, the Rules Committee in the Senate and other committees can investigate what happened with the security perimeter, what the Capitol Police did or did not do. And that's all important as well. But they're not the only questions. We have questions, obviously, about the lead up to it. What was, for example, what was the former president saying in the lead up to it? You got to put people under oath to get the kind of testimony you need. What did he say on that day? For example, when people were calling over and over again, congressional leaders calling, saying, "We need help here. The Capitol is under attack. Lives are at risk." And those calls either went ignored or they purposefully decided not to help. We got to know all that to hold people accountable and to make sure it never happens again. And none of those questions, and there are probably 100 more I couldn't even begin to articulate. So many questions that will go unanswered. And so I think it's about accountability, and it's also about the historical record and learning from mistakes that were made. But the idea that people can come into the Capitol, not just to create havoc, but to come into the Capitol to stop the counting of electoral votes, to upend the government. They were engaged in a coup, a violent coup, frankly, based in white supremacy. I think that's as clear as could be. It was like a demonstration of white supremacy in the Capitol, because they were mad that we were doing well in a lot of states where black voters were helping us win. And so none of that is the subject of review. None of that is important enough to be the subject of review by a commission. Doesn't it trouble that some of these Republicans, that the Republican vice president, a very, very, very conservative Republican, was probably 20 or 30 feet away from his own death? He would have been murdered. Mike Pence would have been murdered by that mob if they got a hold of him. I have no doubt they would have killed other members of Congress in both houses, in both parties, if we didn't have the protection of the Capitol Police and other security that came to our assistance in that moment. Is none of that important enough? Do you have to have the vice president and the Speaker of the House killed to get a commission? Is that the bar that they're setting? So there are so many questions that have to be answered, so that America never has an experience like we had on January the 6th. It was one of the worst days in American history. And every other time we had a terrible day like that, we had an investigation. When a foreign power attacked us in Pearl Harbor, there was a commission. And the sitting president got kicked around a lot about it because he was in power before and after. We had the 9/11 commission. That was a Republican president, and he was criticized. But that commission went forward and had findings. In this case, they seem to want to protect a former president from answering any questions and answering questions under oath. That is just not acceptable. That's not transparency. And if anything, it makes it more likely than less likely that we'll have more violence, other attacks on the Capitol, and other efforts to undermine our democracy. We can't allow that to happen.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just have one quick follow-up, and then we'll go to Miracle. Do you think the lack of bipartisan support, for the January 6th commission, as well as, at least it appears to be, a lack of bipartisan support for our infrastructure, do you think that's going to have a long-term, impact on the future of the filibuster? Or do you still see like there will be attempts, within your caucus as well within the Senate, to continue that tradition?
I think we've got to use a couple of opportunities this year. January 6th Commission is one opportunity to say to the country, this is what happens when you have to get to 60 votes to get something done, as fundamental as this to our democracy and our security. I think another example would be Senate Bill 1. I mean, if we can't get that done because of a 60-vote filibuster rule, that's another reason to change the rules completely, or to alter them, or at least allow a 51-vote rule for something as consequential as Senate Bill 1. I think January 6th might fit that category as well. So I think, KHARI, there are going to be a couple of examples this year. Gun violence is another. Voting rights generally is another. If we cannot make progress and enact into law changes that the American people are demanding, they demanded when they voted for Joe Biden over the other guy. If that's going to be thwarted over and over again, and progress is going to be impeded, we've got to change the rules. So I'm in favor of a general change, but certainly even those who may not favor the rule change for every situation or for every bill should at least favor it to protect our democracy. We think it's been a rough year for the democracy. It could get a lot worse over the next 10 years if these state legislative voting rights, or I should say state legislative voter laws go into effect that undermine voting rights. So we have a lot of reasons, I think, to be very concerned about the 60-vote filibuster rule undermining progress that people should have a right to expect.
Miracle?
Thank you so much for that. And I know you touched a little bit about some racial justice issues. And I wanted to specifically talk about, there's been a lot of conversation about racial inequities. A lot of stuff has been kind of seriously brought to light post the murder of George Floyd. And you have talked about, advocating for maternal mortality issues. You were talking about, supporting youth who go into the foster care system so they can have like educational attainment. You mentioned gun violence earlier. And so I wanted to know, like, specifically, how do you see your office and the role that you play in addressing racial inequities in this region? And what are some legislation that's coming up that you think can help impact the way the racial disparities are in Pennsylvania?
Well, Miracle, I think in some ways it's important for anyone in an elected position to start with the person in the mirror, to be blunt about it. I think there's an old expression the nuns used to use in school about going to confession and confessing your sins. The phrase was examine your conscience. And I think too often in political debates and public officials themselves don't do enough of that. And I think a lot of people, and I think this is true, I hope in both parties, but certainly I know in my own kind of my own personal deliberations, after the murder of George Floyd, I began to ask myself, what are you doing? What are you doing to make it less likely that there'll be another murder like that? What are you doing to examine and acknowledge and confront the kind of systemic racism we have in our society? And there, I thought about issues in a different way, and in some cases thought about issues for the first time that I should have been thinking about years earlier. And so I think it starts there. We have to ask ourselves not only what are we doing, or the other question is, what have we tolerated? We have tolerated systemic racism in so many areas of our lives. Not the most obvious is in criminal justice and policing, but it's not limited to that. That's the harsh reality here. There's systemic racism in housing, in education, in healthcare, in terms of economic opportunity, even in terms of the environment. If you live in a community of color that is low income, if you have both of those kind of circumstances, that there's a higher likelihood that the environment within which you live is more dangerous, that the air is dirtier, and that there are other environmental hazards that folks who live in a neighborhood like mine don't have to worry about, or don't have to worry about as much. So it starts with that. And I think once you get to that point, that leads you into a set of questions about what we should do. Cheryl Ifill of the NAACP, after the murder of George Floyd, said something that was profound and disturbing, and I think I had to apply it to myself. She said his murder, quote, shames us before the world, unquote. But it should also shame us individually. We should be ashamed that we haven't done enough, those of us who are elected officials. So that leads you naturally into supporting the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, to finally have accountability, to not just say over and over again, well, if we have more training, that will fix the problem. No, it won't. There has to be accountability when an American citizen, often a Black man, and increasingly Black women as well, when their rights are violated. They are a citizen whose rights have been violated by an individual who represents the state, in this case, a law enforcement official. And sometimes that violation rises to the level of a criminal violation, but it's hard to win those cases. We got to strengthen that part of the law, the so-called Section 242. Sometimes the violation of that individual's constitutional rights rises to the level of another kind of infraction that should be the subject of a civil action. So you can bring, as a citizen, you can bring a lawsuit and recover damages for the violation of your constitutional rights. So obviously that's just one thing we have to do, but we have so much. You mentioned maternal mortality. I mean, those numbers are so high. I was looking at them recently. Just in our nation, they're high. But here's some of the differences. I just saw these numbers recently. The most recent number I've seen is 2018. The maternal mortality rate was 17.4 per 100,000 live births in the United States. But here's the most troubling part of it. For non-Hispanic Black women, it's not 17%, it's 37%. That's all you need to know, that number is 20 points higher for Black women trying to deliver healthy children. We got to do something about that. And that's why these disparities in healthcare have to be addressed. So that's a long way of saying we need to legislate and need to be focused. Now, the good news is a lot of what we started to do in the rescue plan to invest in communities, to make sure that we're thinking about inequity and equity itself when it comes to other facets of our life and other parts of government. The things we started in the rescue plan have to be considered. That's why you're not hearing much about it yet. You're hearing about the jobs bill and the infrastructure, physical infrastructure. The next part is also, I think, equally important and exciting, which is the families plan, where the president and vice president have said, we want to make sure that every 3 and 4-year-old in the country has universal access to pre-kindergarten education. Not 80% of them, all of them. He's saying, we want to make sure that the families have more access to quality childcare and better healthcare and more opportunities to be covered by healthcare. I think if we stay on this path of investing in families, low-income families, middle-income families, through tax credits, through direct assistance, through food assistance, more Medicaid coverage, there's so much we can do to improve their lives. But I think it has to start with your own reflection on what you have done and not done to advance the cause of some measure of racial equity that we've long ignored.
Now that's all like very, very powerful information. And could you talk a little bit about, because we in all of our travels, have an opportunity to talk to, our everyday citizens, and because they see us, on this platform, they talk to us, about politics, and I run into people, across the entire spectrum. And when you talk about particularly the family element of the infrastructure, plan, can you talk about like why is it so important? Because obviously you get, the conservative argument that it's a drain on the economy, and like, we don't want our public dollars being invested in that way. Can you talk about why it actually, would be something positive for the economy, and it would be something that would help the economy grow, as opposed to some sort of socialized program, that's, taking the, money out of private citizens' hands and giving it to the welfare state, as some would argue?
Yeah, we've been hearing those arguments a long time, haven't we? and even when you get into these numbers, they say, oh my goodness, you're going to have a rescue plan that will cost $1.9 trillion. And when it comes to the tax credits and food assistance and unemployment and healthcare, that's all going to benefit low-income families and middle-income families. And what about the others? What about the wealthy and the connected and the corporate? What are they going to do? And they might be upset by what we did in the rescue plan. And my answer to that is get used to it. We won the election. We're going to make sure that the families that have been left out for generations are going to finally get some help. And if that means that one family who's low income is getting food assistance and a $1,400 check, maybe a second $1,400 check because someone in their family gets it, and they're getting the child tax credit starting in July, or at least the first payment, and they're getting this and they're getting that, I say, yeah, it's about time the families got it. The big corporations have been getting it for 40 years. The rigging of the tax code for major multinational corporations and for very, very wealthy Americans, there's nothing like it in human history. It's to say that it's like speaking an obscenity when you start to describe what these powerful interests have gotten, because they rigged the tax code and they rigged the process of undermining regulations. And they've, to a certain extent, rigged elections by their ability to buy elections through corporate money. And all of that was turned on its head in the rescue plan. and we've got to continue it in the families plan. Look, it's real simple. When you look at the tax code in the United States of America over the last 40 years, even before that gross, obscene bill that the Republicans passed in 2017, that gave away $1.5 trillion to big corporations, and gave think about this, gave the top 1% a $51,000 tax cut in just the first year, when the low income folks were getting $60, 60. And if you're a little higher in income, you might be getting $300, while the top 1% was getting $51,000 per household. That's how gross and obscene this is. And it's been going on for years because they have had power in Washington, and they've been able to overwhelm Washington with high-paid lobbyists. But that's starting to change. We're starting to say families need help right now, and they need a lot of it. And if it costs $1 trillion, we're going to spend $1 trillion. If it costs $2 trillion, we're going to spend that, because we believe in lifting up families and workers, and trying to, frankly, to promote unions so that more folks can join a union and have a higher wage and benefits, and they can support their family with one job. But the whining you get from the corporate crowd is just not something I'm going to pay any attention to, because they have had 40 years of steamrolling everybody else. It's about time we turned it around.
Absolutely. And then we have several minutes left, so we're going to go in our last round of questions. But I guess we'll start with Ryan and go to Miracle.
Yep, thanks, KHARI. And so, being that it's Pride Month, I did want to take a minute to talk about a piece of LGBT legislation that I believe you're a co-sponsor on, and that's the Equality Act. And so, I was just wondering if you could, briefly talk about, what that act is, what different stipulations of that are, what its current status and future outlook is, and your reasons for supporting that act.
Yeah, I think we should view the Equality Act to protect LGBTQ plus Americans as part of a continuum or a steady stream of legislation over a couple of generations now that kind of widened the circle of protection for and validation of the rights of Americans. And I think it's entirely consistent. The Equality Act is entirely consistent with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and so many other pieces of legislation over time where we were providing protections against discrimination to Americans that didn't have that protection before. I mean, it's still hard to comprehend that even with the great and really fast-moving progress we made on marriage equality, it's still the case in the United States of America in most places that you could be married on Saturday or Sunday, but get fired from your job on Monday without much recourse because of your sexual orientation or because of some other reason that they invented. So that's the reality, and it will just provide the same kind of protection against discrimination that we had in those earlier, especially the 64 Civil Rights Act, where it focused on housing, on public accommodations, on education, so that you don't have people denied opportunities. In the first case in 1964, because of the color of their skin, and we know that there's still that's still a challenge where we have to address now. But you also don't want people to be denied opportunities and discriminated against because of who they are and whom they love.
Miracle?
Thank you so much for the answer. And I'm going to kind of merge a couple of questions together, because you mentioned the George Floyd Policing Act, but there's also the BREATHE Act. And so Senate Democrats and just Democrats in general are kind of in this tussle of like, how progressive should the legislation be? How expansive should the legislation be? And so I was wondering, how do you approach these issues? How do you want your constituents to engage you on these issues? And for people who may not even believe in white supremacy or systematic racism, how do you see those conversations going so people can understand how important and pressing the legislative need is for a lot of these bills?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, Miracle. I think the first thing I'd say is that you have to, when you're a legislator, because you represent a state or a congressional district or a legislative district, you have constituents and you've got to serve them. So we have a very effective and capable constituent services team. So they're at that work every day. Something comes in the door on a phone call or a letter or an email where folks are saying, I need help with this program or this department of government. And sometimes just helping them through that thicket of bureaucracy or difficulty in terms of getting a resolution to a question or getting benefits they're entitled to, whether it's veterans benefits or Social Security or the like. That's kind of the bread and butter work we have to do. And by the way, we have to do that even if that person is not a political supporter. We got to serve everybody. That's our obligation. But so I think it's important for people to know that they can turn to you for help when you're a legislator. The good news is, in terms of being able to communicate with legislators, it's so much easier now, and you can have a lot more direct contact because of the tools we have today, whether it's social media or email or other realities of American life that we didn't have 25, 30 years ago. In the old days, you'd write a letter and send it to your member of Congress and hope they could write back to you in a long period of time. Now you have much more direct contact. And I think, frankly, the scrutiny is more substantial now. People know a lot more about what their legislator is doing in real time than they did in the old days when I was growing up. So that's good, and that's a higher bar, and we should meet that bar every day. And then when you encounter someone that you represent and they're in total disagreement with you, I just think you have to try your best to be respectful and to listen to their point of view, and to try to have a dialogue or an engagement, maybe even an argument. But I think we can do that in a respectful way. Now, sometimes people can get abusive. It's difficult to have a conversation with someone who's just, heaping invective on your head or cursing at you. But most people, even those that disagree, are usually respectful. But we got to think of ways to give them an opportunity to express even disagreement with, something I'm voting for or something I voted against. But there are a lot of avenues today that we didn't have a number of years ago. But it's probably never been more important to stay engaged.
Thank you for that. And for the final question, I did want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit, more about the infrastructure bill and the particular timeline. What folks can expect over the next month or two, because I know that is the most pressing, piece of federal legislation before us.
Yeah, that right now, I think a lot of the attention, and I think it's important to explain this because I think it's missed because there's so much focus on one part of this. A lot of the attention is what Joe Biden is negotiating with a few Senate Republicans about, right? So they're talking about how many bridges will they be able to fix if he agrees to a different number, how much can we invest in improvements to water or sewer or the electricity grid or broadband, and all the traditional kind of physical only infrastructure. But I think what a lot of people are missing is that regardless of whether or not he comes to a conclusion or reaches a compromise, our side's going to go forward. We're going to have a big bill that will either cover, when you take the jobs plan and the families plan together, that's about a $4 trillion initiative if you combine the two of them. And I'm one senator, and I think most people in our party, we want to pursue all of that, whether he gets a deal with them for part of it or not. Either way, we're either going to do all of it ourselves with 50 votes or try to do it, or we're going to do most of it because they reached an agreement with the president. So most of the work is still going to have to be done by Democrats through budget reconciliation, because all the things I talked about, childcare, pre-K, community college, some physical infrastructure that Republicans may leave out, home and community-based services for seniors and people with disabilities, all that will be left out if we don't act. So we have to act, and we have to push very hard to try our best to enact something so substantial that we can positively transform the lives of tens of millions of Americans in ways that we weren't even dreaming about even a few years ago. So it's that kind of a moment. We have a moment here that may not come for another 25 years, and we have to act, and we have to act boldly. And I've said, before, we got to go big or go home. No reason to be, to constrain or limit the ambit or reach of our aspirations here.
Absolutely. And I can't think of a better parting shot for a wide-ranging and a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, U.S. Senator Bob Casey from the state of Pennsylvania, joining us for the Sunday Night Sit Down. This has been great. It's been an honor. We really enjoyed this conversation. I know you're super busy, so thank you for sitting down with us for 45 minutes. We really appreciate it.
I want to thank each of you for this opportunity, and I want to thank the artists too, who I know are trying to make changes in our society, who are tuning in as well. And as someone who doesn't have much artistic talent, I have high regard not only for their talent, but also their willingness to be involved in public debate and in public policy.
Thank you so much. Again.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Matt.
And right before we wrap, our last question we asked everyone, we know we're at time, but what is something that is bringing you joy? We know like politics is stressful, a lot of stuff is going on, but what is something that brings you joy?
Miracle, thanks. I think it gets back to something so fundamental. It's family. I've been really blessed to have my wife and 4 daughters with us lately, more than they have in a lot of years. And I've been very fortunate. We just had our first grandchild. It's a grandson, and he's over, this shoulder. It's that guy with the voting t-shirt on. He's just turned a year in April, but we're blessed because we, so many families, throughout the pandemic, I had a job. I never lost my job. I never lost a small business. If I were an owner, and I also was healthy, and my family was. So we've been blessed. And if you can't find joy in those basic blessings, then I don't know what you can find joy in. So I'm lucky.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, U.S. Senator Bob Casey, representing the state of Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks again to U.S. Senator Bob Casey for joining us for a really great conversation. We hope everyone's going to enjoy it either on the replay Sunday night or they get to check it out through the week and enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed this conversation. So before we get into more housekeeping, any quick reflections on tonight's conversation?
Yeah, I think it's just there's a lot of stuff that's coming up, even the legislation. I forgot. I was like, wait a minute. There's a lot of legislation that's coming up that could actually really impact people's lives. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the negotiation process is going to look like in the next couple of weeks, to see how much of these bills are going to get passed. We know that the tax credits are coming soon. So to see if that's going to change the narrative at all once people are getting these direct payments and supports for families. And so I really am appreciative again of the senator coming on to talk about the domestic policy and what he sees for the future of Pennsylvania. So it's a very eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, and along those same lines, it's always nice to be able to sit down with, one specific legislator or individual for this, long and in-depth of a conversation, just to be able to really get into the details of a lot of different pieces of legislation like that, just to really break down a lot of the different aspects of it, what the funding allocation will look like, where's that going to go, just a lot of those different details, that it's, not always easy to access otherwise without going through and actually, trying to read the specific bills or keep up with the, with the ongoing discussions on that yourself. So it's always a really good opportunity to have that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Obviously our platform, a central focus of what we do, is to really bring folks who don't watch MSNBC, don't watch CNN, on a regular basis, provide a platform where they're comfortable with folks they're comfortable with having these same conversations, that with the same people that they're talking to, on MSNBC, and, on any given day, you could turn on MSNBC and see Senator Casey, on there, because he is one of the most, prominent and influential, senators, in the entire country, representing a very important state of Pennsylvania. We're, honored to be able to, have this platform to be able to share with folks. And we hope, folks can take this information, and use it, whether at the local level, all the way to the federal level. And again, we can't thank, Senator Casey enough, for his time, knowing how busy, members of the United States Senate are. So any housekeeping you want to share with us, Miracle, before we go?
We know we're just back, but again, if you haven't registered to vote, please go ahead and register to vote. We do have another election coming up in November. Remember, we have elections every 6 months. Remember, y'all said y'all wanted us to be out here outside the presidential election. And so we heard you, and we're going to do just that. So tomorrow, we're actually going to be sitting down with the various media personalities and just breaking down the primary election, talking about what's next, what we're going to be voting for, the lessons learned, the takeaway. So please make sure you tune in for that. Again, we're going to have some really great programming coming up for you all. In addition, if you are an artist, One Hood, our city organization, is doing an artist call because Juneteenth is coming up. And so we're doing like art deliberation. And so if you're an artist and you want to do some art, please reach out to One Hood Media to be a part of our Juneteenth program. It's going to be really fun. We're going to have food, fun, music, art, and engagement. So that's something we're looking forward to as well. And so we hope you all had a great day. We hope you had a great Pride. And we look forward to seeing you all throughout the week. So that's it.
Absolutely. And again, special thanks to Senator Bob Casey and his very, very capable and helpful and gracious staff for helping pull this together. On behalf of Miracle Jones and Ryan White, thank you for joining the Sunday Night Sit Down. Remember to join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. for the One Hood Power Hour primary recap with Chris Potter, as well from WESA, as well as Alexis Johnson from Vice News will be joining us. So that's going to be a fantastic conversation. Thanks again for joining us. I'll see you next Sunday and see you tomorrow night for the One Hood Power Hour. Take care.